They laughed when a flatbed truck dumped 800 rotting oak wine barrels behind my fence line in the spring of 2021, and Ridgemont Vineyards Corporation called it a neighborly favor. I was 31 years old. I'd buried my grandfather just 4 months earlier. Comment below with the state or country you're watching from right now, especially if you've ever inherited land, or a mess, that nobody thought you could actually keep standing, and hit subscribe before this story gets a lot worse before it gets better. The first loop started that same week, when Mr. Caldwell from Ridgemont pulled his truck up my gravel drive wearing shoes that cost more than my monthly diesel bill, and told me Split Creek Orchard, all 42 acres of it, was sitting on the only flat ground left for his company's new tasting pavilion, and he had a number for me. $340,000. Take it, or watch the county reroute the access road around me until the offer dropped. The second loop opened an hour later when Dale Pruitt, the extension agent who'd known my grandfather 30 years, stood in my kitchen flipping through Silas Whitfield's leather ledgers like they were kindling, and told me, without looking up, that everything my grandfather wrote about curing wood by feel instead of by moisture meter was folk superstition dressed up as agriculture. The third loop was quieter. It was the ledgers themselves, stacked 26 deep on the shelf above the wood stove, each one dated back to 1974, each one full of his handwriting getting shakier every year, and one line, underlined twice near the end, that I didn't understand yet. Wood remembers the wine it held. Give it time, and it will tell you what it wants to become. My grandfather bought Split Creek in 1979 with money saved from 2 decades working a sawmill outside McMinnville, and he spent the next 42 years turning it into an orchard that never made him rich but never once went under. Not during the freeze of 1990, not during the 2 years the codling moths took 40% of the crop. He grew Bartlett pears on 26 of the acres, and a mixed block of Gravenstein and Newtown Pippin apples on the rest, and he pruned every one of the 1,100 trees himself until his hands stopped cooperating around 2018. He died in November of 2021, 78 years old, in the same bedroom he was born in 2 miles down the road, and the funeral home charged me $1,100 I didn't have. I remember standing in that bedroom afterward, the window cracked the way he always kept it, the smell of wood smoke and bag balm still on the quilt, and thinking I had no idea how to run 42 acres of anything. I came back from Portland, where I'd been managing a furniture warehouse for 6 years, because there was nobody else. My mother was gone, my father remarried and moved to Arizona, and stopped calling around 2015. It was me, the orchard, and 31 years old with a checking account that had $400 in it the week the barrels showed up. My grandfather never once, in 42 years, hired an accountant, a consultant, or an agronomist to tell him what his own land was already telling him for free. He walked the rows every morning at 5:30 with a thermos of black coffee and a pocket knife, cutting a sliver of bark here and there, tasting the soil when he thought no one was watching, and he wrote it all down that same night in the same brand of leather ledger he bought a case of at a time from a saddlery in Salem. I used to think it was superstition when I was a teenager helping him on weekends. I didn't understand until I was sitting in his kitchen at 31, with 800 barrels rotting on my fence line, that every line in those books was data, just data collected with a pocket knife, and 42 years instead of a laptop and a grant. Ridgemont Vineyards sat on the ridge above my east fence, 320 acres of Pinot Noir that had been expanding every year since the winery went corporate in 2016, bought out by a hospitality group out of Seattle that Caldwell answered to. The barrels weren't a gift. French oak barrels cost between $600 and $900 new, and a winery gets 3, maybe 4 uses out of 1 before the wood stops giving flavor, and after that they're waste. Expensive to haul to a landfill that charges by weight, expensive to burn under new air quality rules the county passed in 2020. Caldwell's crew dumped them on the low pasture along my fence line because the access road ran through what used to be my grandfather's property before a boundary dispute in the 90s gave Ridgemont the easement, and because nobody expected the orchard's new owner to be a 31-year-old woman who didn't know a property line from a suggestion. 800 barrels, stacked 11 feet high in places, some split at the hoops and leaking dark red-black wine residue into the grass, staining it the color of dried blood by the second week. The smell hit before the sight did. sour wine and wet char and something sweeter underneath that I didn't have a name for yet, and it carried on the wind clear to the porch every evening once the June heat set in. I found 2 of the stacks had already toppled onto what used to be my grandfather's pear windbreak, snapping 4 young trees he'd planted the spring before he died. Caldwell came back 3 days later, and that was the second time I'd ever spoken to him, though the first time barely counted. A handshake at my grandfather's memorial, where he'd said Silas was a fine neighbor, in the tone people use when they mean nothing at all. This time he leaned against his truck with the barrels behind him like scenery, and told me the pavilion plans were already through county planning, that the road easement gave Ridgemont rights to stage material on the pasture for up to a year, that my grandfather had let them do smaller dumps before without complaint, and that $340,000 was, in his words, more money than an orchard this size would clear in 15 years of fruit. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled like he'd already spent the money, tapped the hood of his truck twice with his knuckles, and drove off without waiting for anything more than that. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers and read until 4 in the morning, and somewhere around page 200, in an entry from 1997, I found it. My grandfather writing about a batch of barrel staves a distillery in Dundee had given him for kindling, and how instead of burning them he'd planed one down, and underneath the char was oak so tight-grained and saturated with old spirit that it took a finish better than anything he'd bought new. He built a single side table from it. I still have that table. I'd been eating breakfast on it my entire life, without knowing what it was. Dale Pruitt showed up the following Tuesday for what he called a courtesy soil consultation, though I hadn't requested one, and Caldwell had clearly asked the extension office to send someone to back up the sale. Pruitt walked my orchard rows with a moisture meter and a laptop bag, citing yield per acre averages from a statewide database, and when I mentioned my grandfather's method of reading bark color and listening to how the leaves moved before deciding when to prune, he actually laughed, a short exhale through his nose, and said sentiment was not a substitute for data, that Silas Whitfield had been a stubborn old man who got lucky more than he got right. He said it standing 3 feet from the barrel pile, close enough that the smell must have hit him too, though he didn't mention it. He pulled up a chart on his laptop showing county-wide average Brix levels for pear orchards, and told me, tapping the screen twice for emphasis, that my grandfather's yields technically underperformed the regional mean by 11%, as if 11% hadn't kept a family fed and a mortgage paid for 4 decades. That was his fixed note, every visit after, condescension dressed as science, always delivered with a statistic that sounded impressive, and never once accounted for the 42 years the orchard had survived without him. He came back twice more that first summer, once in July to note soil moisture readings he said contradicted my grandfather's pruning log, and once in September, standing at the edge of the barrel pile with a clipboard, to tell me that whatever I was doing back there with a bandsaw was, in his professional opinion, a distraction from real agricultural priorities, and that the county had actual resources for grief counseling if I needed a referral. I started on the barrels alone in June, using the last $1,100 I had after the funeral home was paid off, buying a used bandsaw off a farm auction site and borrowing my grandfather's old planer, the one he'd kept oiled in the barn since before I was born. I worked after dark most nights because the days went to the orchard, breaking barrel staves down, sanding through decades of char to the wine-dark oak underneath, my hands raw and stained purple-black by August, the smell of tannin and sawdust soaked into every shirt I owned. Earl Higgins, who farmed the walnut orchard across the county road, started calling me the barrel witch to anyone who'd listen at the co-op, and told my neighbor Dottie Marsh, loud enough for it to circle back to me within a week, that grief did strange things to a woman's judgment, that I'd clearly lost the sense my grandfather at least had the decency to keep. He said it a second time in August, standing at the feed store counter while I was 3 people back in line buying planer blades, loud enough that I heard every word, something about how Silas would be ashamed to see his granddaughter playing carpenter with somebody else's garbage, instead of running the orchard right. I didn't turn around. I paid for the blades and drove home. Dottie was the one who told me, standing in my driveway with a jar of her own plum jam, that Earl said it laughing, and that she didn't think it was funny at all, though at the time she didn't say much else either. That was the second loop tightening, not just Caldwell's number sitting on the table, but the whole county deciding I was something to pity. The work itself was slow in a way nothing about my old warehouse job had prepared me for. Breaking a barrel down meant knocking the iron hoops loose with a mallet, my shoulders aching by the third barrel of the night, then prying each curved stave free and running it through the band saw to true, one face flat before the planer could touch it. The char inside every stave went 4 different colors as I worked through it, black to deep amber to a red-brown so dark it looked wet even dry, and underneath that the raw oak grain, tight and pale, soaked through with 2 or 3 years of Pinot Noir that had worked itself half an inch into the wood. I kept a bucket of water by the workbench just to rinse the wine stain off my hands before I went inside, and it never fully came out from under my nails that whole summer. Some nights I worked until 1 in the morning with nothing but the barn's single bulb and a space heater that barely cut the September chill, and I'd catch myself talking out loud to my grandfather the way I used to when I helped him prune, asking whether I was reading the wood right the way he used to read a tree's bark before deciding where to cut. By September, I had built 4 side tables and a bench from reclaimed barrel oak, the wood grain deep red-brown where the wine had soaked in over years of aging Pinot Noir, and I drove them 40 minutes to a farmer's market in McMinnville with $300 in gas money I couldn't spare. Nobody bought anything the first 2 weekends. The third weekend, a woman named Priya Anand stopped at my table for nearly 20 minutes, ran her hand along the bench, asked where the wood came from, and when I told her, she took photos with her phone and said she wrote for a regional design magazine and had never seen barrel oak finished like that. Most reclaimed pieces went dull and gray. Mine had kept the color the wine left behind. She didn't promise anything. She just took the photos and left her card. I didn't expect to hear from her again, and for 2 months I didn't. If you've ever built something with your hands while everyone around you called it a waste of time, I want you to know I felt every bit of that doubt too. So hit subscribe now, because the next part is where the county stopped laughing. The doubt came hardest in October, alone in the barn at 11 at night with sawdust in my lungs, a space heater ticking uselessly in the corner, rain drumming on the tin roof loud enough to drown out my own thoughts, and a bank statement that said I had $600 to get through winter. I sat on an overturned barrel and let myself, for exactly 1 night, believe Earl and Pruitt might be right, that I was a grieving woman playing with wood instead of running an orchard like a functioning adult. I pulled out my grandfather's last ledger, the one from 2021, his handwriting barely legible by the final entries, and near the back I found a page I hadn't read closely before, a list, dated March of that year, 8 months before he died, titled simply For Mara. It wasn't sentimental, it was practical. The way everything he wrote was practical. Barrel staves hold flavor the way land holds memory. Don't waste either one waiting for someone else to tell you they're valuable. Underneath it, smaller, you'll know when it's ready, because everyone else will still be saying it isn't. I read that line 4 times. I went back out to the barn and finished the table I'd been sanding. Caldwell's second visit that fall wasn't friendly. The county had approved the pavilion permit contingent on Ridgemont clearing the barrel pile off my pasture by December, a detail he hadn't mentioned when he dumped them, and now he wanted them gone, offering to haul them to landfill himself at no cost to me, framing it as generosity. I told him I was keeping them, all 800, or what remained of the roughly 600 I hadn't yet cut down. He looked at the barn, at the stacked lumber, at 4 benches and a set of shelving drying under tarps, and said, with the particular flatness of a man recalculating, that he supposed grief hobbies were cheaper than therapy. Renata Cole showed up 2 weeks later, a junior attorney for the hospitality group, sent to review whether the barrels legally still belonged to Ridgemont once dumped on my land, whether I could be compelled to surrender them or charge storage fees for the pasture space. She spent 40 minutes citing waste disposal statutes at my kitchen table, the same table my grandfather built from the first stave he ever planed, without once asking what I'd made from the rest. I told her the barrels had been abandoned property since June, and Oregon law backed me. She left without the paperwork she came for. The market crisis that changed everything hit in February of 2022, when a series of wildfires through Northern California's timber country, combined with tariff disputes disrupting French oak imports, pushed domestic barrel and furniture-grade oak lumber prices up 61% in 4 months. the steepest single-season spike the Pacific Northwest hardwood market had seen in a decade. A cooperage outside Sonoma that Ridgemont had used for 15 years sent a letter that February saying new French oak barrels would run $940 each starting that spring, up from $610 the year before, with no guarantee of supply past summer. Winemakers across the valley suddenly couldn't source new barrels at any reasonable price, and furniture makers, who'd built businesses on fresh-milled oak, were quoting clients double what they'd charged the year before, some shutting down custom orders entirely until prices settled. I raised my own prices only once that spring, and only by enough to cover the extra fuel it took hauling barrels from 3 new wineries who'd started calling me instead of paying landfill fees that had tripled overnight. Priya Anand called me the first week of March. Her magazine wanted to run a feature on sustainable reclaimed materials in the wine country economy, and she'd kept my card for 5 months because, in her words, she had a feeling the timing would eventually make sense. It made sense now. She photographed the barn, the finished pieces, 22 of them by then, and the ledgers themselves, open on the workbench, my grandfather's handwriting visible in the frame. The feature ran in April under the headline that named Split Creek Orchard directly, and within 3 weeks I had orders for 40 pieces and a waiting list past that. A regional furniture retailer in Portland reached out wanting to carry a line, and Ridgemont Vineyards, sitting on 300 more barrels from their spring bottling with nowhere cheap left to dump them, needed a new plan, because the landfill fees they'd been counting on had tripled along with everything else in a lumber-scarce market, and burning barrels under the new air rules now carried real fines. The county agricultural fair that June hosted its first sustainable materials showcase, set up right in the same commerce pavilion where farmers had weighed grain against each other for 60 years, the same wooden scales still bolted to the concrete floor from 1961, numbers posted on a board for everyone walking through to see, chalk numbers rewritten twice that day as more sales came in over the course of the afternoon. My booth listed the math plainly on a hand-lettered chalkboard, the same kind my grandfather used to price pears at the roadside stand. 611 barrels salvaged, $41,000 in furniture sold in 3 months, versus the landfill and burn costs Ridgemont would have eaten disposing of the same wood, now calculated at nearly $18,000 given the new fee structure. Priya's article sat printed and pinned to the corkboard behind the table, and a small line of people waited to touch the wood grain themselves, running their fingers over the deep red-brown stain the wine had left behind decades earlier. Dale Pruitt was there representing the Extension Office's own soil and materials panel, standing at the edge of the crowd in the same khaki jacket he always wore, and when a reporter asked him directly whether reclaimed barrel wood held up structurally against kiln-dried new oak, he had to read from data his own office had finally collected that spring, data that confirmed what my grandfather's 42 years of ledgers had already told him for free. He didn't apologize, he just said the results were noteworthy, in the same flat voice he'd once used to call my grandfather lucky, and I watched him close his laptop a little too fast. Caldwell walked into the pavilion 20 minutes later, and I watched him see the board before he saw me. He needed a supplier who could take his overflow barrels at a price below the new disposal fees, and Ridgemont's hospitality group above him wanted a partnership story for their own marketing now that reclaimed materials were suddenly fashionable instead of embarrassing. He offered a standing contract, Ridgemont's full barrel output, every season, at a price I set. I told him I'd take the barrels, but the pasture stayed permanently mine, no easement renewal ever again, and the price was the one I quoted, not negotiable down, $85 a barrel for what he'd once tried to dump on me for free. He asked, almost as an afterthought, glancing back at the barrel oak booth behind me, if I'd consider the $340,000 for the land again, and I told him the land wasn't for sale, that it had never really been for sale, not in 2021, and not now, and that he was welcome to write that down this time instead of assuming. He signed it, standing in the same pavilion where Earl had once called me the Barrel Witch, loud enough for the whole co-op to hear, and Earl was standing 11 feet away when Caldwell signed it, close enough that I watched him look down at his own boots and not say a single word. Dottie Marsh switched sides that same afternoon, though she'd been leaning that way since October, and told me flat out she'd sell me her late husband's table saw for whatever I could pay, because she'd rather see it running again than sitting in her barn collecting dust while I turned down orders. Earl never apologized outright. 2 years later, struggling with his own walnut yields during a drought that hit the valley in 2024, he asked, through Dottie, whether I'd consider looking at his soil the way my grandfather used to, and I did, for free, and never mentioned the barrel witch comment again, though I noticed he never used it either. By 2028, 6 years after that first flatbed truck, Split Creek Furniture Works employed 4 people out of the same barn where I'd sanded my hands raw alone at midnight, sourcing reclaimed oak from 11 wineries across Yamhill County, clearing over $250,000 in annual revenue, none of it from selling the orchard, all 42 acres still standing, still mine, the pear trees my grandfather planted still bearing fruit every August, the way they always had. I kept the orchard running the whole time too, never let the furniture side swallow it, because the two things had never really been separate to me, both of them just different ways of listening to what the land already knew. Caldwell left Ridgemont in 2026 for a hospitality group in Napa, and the last time I saw him he asked, almost sincerely, standing in my driveway in a different pair of expensive shoes, how I'd known the barrels would be worth something, and I told him the honest truth, that I hadn't known, I just trusted that my grandfather rarely ever wrote anything down that didn't matter, and that 800 barrels dumped out of pure spite had turned out to be the best thing Ridgemont ever gave me completely for free. Renata Cole now works for a sustainability compliance firm and cited my operation, without naming me directly at first, in a white paper on agricultural waste reuse, until I emailed her the correction myself, and to her credit she fixed it within the week, and sent an apology I actually believed. Dale Pruitt retired in 2027 and, to his credit, sent me a card, 4 sentences long, the last one admitting that 42 years of ledgers had turned out to be a longer study than anything his office ever funded. I never turned that card into a story I tell for spite. I just kept it, tucked into the front cover of ledger number 26, because my grandfather never once wasted a piece of paper either. My grandfather's ledgers sit on the same shelf they always have, 26 of them now 31, the last 5 filled with my own handwriting, my own numbers, my own failures written down as plainly as his ever were. 2 months ago, my niece, 19 years old and finishing her first year studying forestry, asked if she could read them, and I watched her sit at that very same worn kitchen table for nearly 6 hours without moving even once, the way I once did, the same window cracked the way it always is, the same smell of wood smoke drifting in from the stove I still haven't replaced. She stopped twice to ask me questions, and I answered both. But when she got near the back of ledger number 12, near that line about wood remembering the wine it held, she went quiet, and didn't ask anything at all, and I didn't tell her what she'd find there, because some things a person has to be patient enough to discover for themselves, the same way I did, alone, at that same kitchen table, rain on the same tin roof, sawdust still under my nails, 31 years old and certain I'd already lost everything worth keeping. I think about my grandfather's line more than any other now, the one underlined twice, about wood remembering what it held and needing time to tell you what it wants to become, and I wonder sometimes how much of that was ever really about wood at all, or whether he was writing it for me the whole time, sitting alone in that same kitchen decades before I was even born, knowing I'd need it more than I'd need the money, knowing patience was the one inheritance no corporation could ever dump on a fence line or dig up with a permit. What would you have done, at 31, alone, with 800 barrels nobody else on this earth wanted? The very next story starts with a woman who inherited 11,000 honeybee colonies and a debt she didn't know existed, and if you've made it this far listening to a woman rebuild a farm out of someone else's garbage, you've already shown me you're the kind of person who finishes what they start. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button before the next one starts, because you already know you're staying for it.